It was the year 1000 in the west of Iceland. The air in the longhouse at Hardarholt was thick with the smell of wood smoke and simmering stew. Gudrun Osvifarsdottir was a woman of high standing, known for her beauty and her fierce pride. Her husband, Thordur Ingunnarsson, was wealthy and well-regarded, but their marriage was not a happy one. Gudrun felt he was not the man she thought he was. The final straw came one evening. Thordra had a new tunic made. It was a fine piece of clothing, dyed a deep blue, but it was cut in a new fashion. The neckline was wide and low, so low that it exposed his collarbones and the top of his chest. Gudrun saw him and felt a cold fury. This was not how a man should dress. This was womanly soft. It was a sign of weakness, an invitation to mockery. And she would not be married to a man who invited mockery. The law was on her side. The ancient Icelandic legal code, the Gragas, was very specific about such things. That night, she did not wait. She went to their bed where Thordur lay. With her were 9 witnesses she had gathered, as the law required. She stood before him, her voice clear and steady in the quiet of the longhouse. She declared, using the precise legal formula, that she was divorced from him. The reason was clear. He wore a shirt cut so low that he showed his nipples. It was a woman's garment. And so she was no longer his wife. She gathered her things, her original dowry, and her personal property. She walked out of his home a free woman. The marriage was over, not with a quiet discussion, but with a public declaration rooted in the law over a piece of clothing. Number 21. A marriage was first and foremost a contract. In the year 890, in a fjord near what is now Bergen, Norway, a young man named Rolf wanted to marry a woman named Astrid. Rolf was the son of a farmer with a good plot of land. Astrid was the daughter of a shipbuilder who owned a share in 2 longships. This was not a matter of Rolf simply asking Astrid. It was a negotiation between 2 families, 2 clans. It was business. Rolf's father, Einar, went with his 2 brothers to the home of Astrid's father, Magnus. They did not talk about love. They sat by the fire in Magnus's longhouse, and they talked about assets. This was the process of arranging a marriage. It was a public affair, a strategic alliance. The first thing they discussed was the munder, or bride price. This was not Rolf buying Astrid. It was a payment from the groom's family to the bride's father or guardian. It was a compensation for the loss of a daughter, a worker, and a member of their family, but it was also a security deposit. It demonstrated the groom's family had the resources to support a new household. Einar offered 10 cows and 20 ounces of silver. Magnus considered this. Astrid was his eldest daughter. She was skilled at weaving and managing a household. She was also of good lineage. Her uncle was a respected chieftain. Magnus countered. He wanted 12 cows, 20 ounces of silver, and a promise of support in any legal dispute for the next 5 years. They argued for a long time. They drank ale. They weighed the silver on a small scale. Finally, they agreed. 12 cows, 20 ounces of silver, and Hrolf's family would stand with Magnus's family at the local assembly, the thing, if a dispute arose. This agreement was the festarmal, the betrothal. It was a legally binding verbal contract. It was sealed with handshakes in front of witnesses. If Hrolf backed out now, his family would lose the agreed-upon price and suffer a great loss of honor. If Magnus backed out, he would have to pay a fine and his family's reputation would be damaged. The feelings of Rolf and Astrid were a secondary concern. The primary goal was to link the 2 families, to merge their wealth and influence, and to ensure the new couple had a solid economic foundation. The marriage was a tool for building community, for creating stability, and for securing the future of the family line. It was a practical arrangement for a practical people. Number 20, the bride kept control of her own property. Ingrid was the daughter of a wealthy landowner in the Danish lands around the year 950. When she married Svein, a man whose family owned a trading ship, she did not arrive empty-handed. Her father gave her a substantial dowry, the Heimanfylgja. This was not a gift to her new husband or his family. It was hers, It consisted of a small plot of farmland inherited from her grandmother, 6 milk cows, a chest of fine linens, and her personal jewelry, including 2 silver brooches and a necklace of amber beads. This property was legally hers to control for the rest of her life. Svein was her husband. He managed their combined household. He could use the milk from her cows to make cheese to sell. He could work the land she brought into the marriage. But he could not sell any of it. Not without her explicit consent given in front of witnesses. This was a crucial aspect of a Viking woman's legal standing. Her dowry provided her with a measure of independence and security. A few years into the marriage, Svein had a bad trading season. A storm damaged his ship, and he lost a cargo of furs. He was in debt. He came to Ingrid and told her he needed to sell her small plot of farmland to cover his losses. The land was good, and a neighbor was willing to pay a high price in silver. Ingrid listened. She walked out to the plot of land. She remembered her grandmother working it. It was her connection to her own family, her own lineage. It was her safety net. She told Svein no, she would not sell it. She suggested other ways to raise the money. They could sell some of the younger cattle from his own herd. They could call on his kinsman for a loan. But her land was not to be sold. Svein was angry, but there was nothing he could do. The law was clear. The property she brought into the marriage remained hers. If he tried to sell it without her permission, the sale would be invalid. She could take him before the thing, and the law would be on her side. This right was her protection. If Svein divorced her, or if he died, that property would return to her. It was her portion, her security, in a world that could be very uncertain. It meant she was not just a dependent in her husband's house, she was a partner, an individual with her own assets and her own legal rights. Number 19, a man's shirt could end his marriage. The story of Gudrun Osvifursdottir in early 11th century Iceland is not just a strange anecdote. It reveals a core principle of Viking society, the strict enforcement of gender roles, and the immense importance of honor. Gudrun's husband, Thordur Ingunnarsson, did not commit a crime in the modern sense. He simply wore a fashionable new shirt with a low-cut neckline. But in the eyes of his wife and his community, this was a serious transgression. The Gragas, the Icelandic law code, had specific provisions for divorce. A wife could divorce her husband for several reasons. One of them was if he adopted feminine habits or clothing. A man wearing a shirt cut so low it revealed his chest, like a woman might, was seen as effeminate. It was called kvenskap, or womanliness. This was not just a fashion faux pas, it was a deep insult to his own masculinity and, by extension, to the honor of his wife. A man who acted like a woman could not be expected to fulfill the duties of a man, like defending his family or running a farm effectively. He made himself an object of ridicule. For a woman like Gudrun, who was described in the Laxdæla saga as being proud and conscious of her status, being married to such a man was intolerable. Her honor was tied to his shame became her shame. The law gave her a way out. But the process had to be followed exactly. Well, she couldn't just tell him she was leaving. First, she had to declare her intent to divorce at their home. The law specified 3 places: at their bedside, at the main threshold of the Longhouse, and in public at the Althing, the National Assembly. She chose the most direct and personal venue, the bedside. Second, she needed witnesses. This was not a private matter, and divorce was a legal proceeding that affected the whole community. She brought 9 of her neighbors to stand with her as she made her declaration. And third, she had to use a precise legal formula. She had to state her name, her husband's name, and the specific legal reason for the divorce. She named her witnesses and called on them to remember her words at the thing if the divorce was ever challenged. Well, by doing this, she dissolved the marriage legally and publicly. She was free to remarry, and she was entitled to her full dowry and half of their shared property. Thordur was left with his fashionable shirt and a deep public humiliation. The rule was not about the shirt. It was about what the shirt represented: a violation of the social order and an affront to the honor that held their world together. Number 18, the morning gift was the wife's personal wealth. The day after their wedding feast, which lasted 3 days and involved the consumption of several barrels of ale, Ketil, a chieftain from Jutland, came to his new wife, Runa. It was around the year 920. The longhouse was quiet now, the guests having returned to their own farms. In his hand, Ketil held a heavy silver arm ring, intricately carved with the image of a serpent. This was not just a gift. This was the Morgengafu, the morning gift. This tradition was a vital part of the marriage contract. The morning gift was a present from the husband to his wife on the morning after the marriage was consummated. It was a token of his satisfaction with the union and a recognition of her new status as his wife. But more importantly, it became her sole and exclusive property. It was separate from her dowry Heimenfilja and separate from the bride price Munder. This was wealth that belonged to her and her alone. The value of the morning gift depended on the husband's status and wealth. For a simple farmer, it might be a new set of weaving tools or a single milk cow. For a powerful chieftain like Ketil, it was a significant display of his riches and his esteem for his new wife and her family. Aruna's morning gift was more than just the arm ring. Ketil also gifted her a small farmstead on the edge of his lands, complete with a family of thralls to work it. This property was now hers. She could manage it, collect its revenues, and do with it as she pleased. She could sell its produce, use the silver from the arm ring to buy fine cloth from a traveling merchant, or gift a portion of it to a kinsman in need. Ketil had no say in how she used her morning gift. It was her personal fund, her independent wealth. This gave her a degree of financial autonomy that was significant. If Ketil died, she would still have her morning gift, in addition to her dowry and whatever portion of his inheritance she was entitled to. It provided a safety net. If she found herself in a difficult situation, she had resources that were entirely under her own control. The morning gift was a clear legal and social acknowledgement that a wife was not merely a dependent. She was a key partner in the household, an individual with her own wealth and her own economic agency. For Runa, that silver arm ring was not just a beautiful object, it was a symbol of her power and her security in her new life. Number 17, divorce required the right words in the right place. Around the year 1050, in the Orkney Islands, a farmer named Finn was married to a woman named Helga. Their marriage was a poor match. They argued constantly over the management of their farm. Finn was a poor manager and the farm was failing. Helga, who came from a more prosperous family, felt he was squandering her dowry and ruining their future. She decided she had to divorce him, but deciding was not enough. The law of the Norse world was highly formal. Simply packing your bags and leaving did not legally end a marriage. To dissolve the union, a specific procedure, a verbal formula, had to be enacted in front of witnesses. This was the Skilnader, the declaration of separation. Helga knew she had legal grounds. The law codes, like the Norwegian Gulating law, stated that if a husband mismanaged the family finances to the point of poverty, the wife could divorce him. But she had to do it correctly. She first went to her brother and her uncle. She explained the situation and told them her intentions. They agreed to act as her witnesses and support her. The law required the declaration to be made at the threshold of their home. This was a significant place, the boundary between the private world of the household and the public world outside. Standing at the threshold, Helga waited for Finn to be present. She then called her witnesses forward. With her brother on her right and her uncle on her left, she spoke the legal formula. She stated her name, Helga, daughter of Magnus. She stated her husband's name, Finn, son of Thorkel. She declared that she was divorcing him. She listed her reason, that he had impoverished them through his poor management, and that he could no longer provide for the household, a key duty of a husband. She named her witnesses and stated that they had heard her words. That was the act. It was done. The marriage was legally over. She did not need Finn's consent. His agreement was irrelevant. Her public declaration, correctly performed, was all that was required. After the declaration at the threshold, she was also required to repeat it publicly at the local thing. This ensured the entire community knew the marriage was dissolved and that both she and Finn were free to remarry. The process was designed to be public and undeniable. It prevented disputes about who was married to whom. It was a system that relied not on paperwork, but on spoken words, witnesses, and public knowledge. Helga had followed the rules, and now she was a free woman, able to claim back her dowry and start a new life. Number 16, the keys to the farm were the wife's domain. When Sigrid married Leif in the year 985 and moved to his farmstead in Iceland, her new life began not with a romantic gesture, but with a formal ceremony. On the first day in her new home, Leif's mother, who was retiring from her duties, met her at the door of the main longhouse. In her hands, she held a large ring of iron keys. These were the keys to the food stores, the chests of linen and valuables, and the storehouses. She handed them to Sigrid. This was a powerful moment. The handing over of the keys signified the transfer of authority over the entire domestic sphere. From that moment on, Sigrid was the husfreyja, the lady of the house. Leif might be the master of the farm, responsible for the fields, the livestock, and defending the property. But everything inside the longhouse was Sigrid's domain. She was now the keeper of the keys. This was not a symbolic title. It was a job with immense responsibility. She was in charge of the food supplies for the entire household, which could include their children, elderly relatives, and a dozen farmhands and thralls. She had to ration the salted fish and dried meat to last through the long, dark winter. She had to know how much grain was needed for baking and brewing ale. Wasting food could mean starvation. She was also the household's chief financial officer. She held the key to the chest where the family's valuables were kept, the hack silver used for trade, the fine jewelry, and the imported cloth. When a trader came to their valley, it was Sigrid who would bargain for new iron pots or glass beads, using the butter and wool she had produced and stored. In her role extended to clothing and textiles. She managed the wool from their sheep, overseeing its cleaning, spinning, and weaving into the cloth needed for clothes, blankets, and sails. She was a manager of people, directing the work of the women and thralls in the household, in everything from milking the cows to preparing meals. Leif would not dare to enter the storeroom and take food without her permission. It was simply not his place. To do so would be a grave insult to her authority. The keys were a physical manifestation of her power. They hung from her belt as she went about her day, a constant signal to everyone on the farmstead of her status and her control. The success of the farm depended just as much on her careful management inside the house as it did on Leif's hard labor in the fields. Number 15, a husband's violence was grounds for divorce. In a small coastal community in Norway around the year 900, a woman named Yrsa suffered at the hands of her husband Bjorn. Bjorn had a temper, and when he drank too much ale, he would strike her. For a time, Yrsa endured it in silence, but the law provided her with a way out. Norse society did not tolerate the abuse of a free woman. It was a matter of honor, both for the woman and for her family. The law codes, such as the Gragas in Iceland, were explicit on this point. A man was not permitted to strike his wife. If he did, she had the right to divorce him immediately, but there was a specific and perhaps strange condition attached to this right. The law stated that if a husband struck his wife 3 times, she could divorce him, but she had to have witnesses to the marks of the blows. After Bjorn struck her for the 3rd time, leaving a dark bruise on her arm and a cut on her cheek, Yrsa had had enough. The next morning, she did not hide the marks. She went to the home of her father and her brothers. She showed them the injuries. This was the first step. Her own family had to be willing to stand with her and support her claim. An attack on her was an attack on their family's honor. Her family was outraged. Her father and 2 brothers immediately went with her back to her longhouse. There, they confronted Bjorn. In front of her kinsmen as witnesses, Yrsa declared herself divorced from Bjorn. The reason was his violence against her. She pointed to the marks on her body as proof. The divorce was not just about her leaving. It had severe financial consequences for Bjorn. Because he was the party at fault, Yrsa was entitled to her full dowry back. She was also entitled to a share of their communal property. Furthermore, her family could demand financial compensation, a fine called bog from Bjorn for the injuries, and the insult to their honor. If he refused to pay, it could lead to a blood feud. This rule, sometimes called the three-slap rule, was a powerful protection for women. It made domestic violence a public and legal matter, not a private one. A man knew that if he struck his wife, he risked not only losing her, but also facing financial ruin and the wrath of her entire family. For Yosa, the law was not an abstract concept. It was a very real tool that allowed her to escape a bad situation and reclaim her life and her property. Number 14, fostering children, was a common and binding practice. Olaf was a powerful chieftain in the Trondheim region of Norway in the mid-10th century. He had a son named Eric. At the same time, his political rival, a lesser chieftain named Harold, also had a son named Sven. Tensions between the two families had been simmering for years over a land dispute. To prevent this from escalating into a feud, they decided to forge a bond. They would not arrange a marriage. Instead, they would use the powerful custom of fostering. Olaf sent his son Eric at the age of 7 to be raised in Harold's household. This was a very common practice among the Norse, particularly the wealthy and powerful. A foster child, or fostri, was not an orphan or a poor relation. Sending a child to be fostered was a great honor for the foster family. It created a bond between the two families that was considered as strong or even stronger than blood. Eric lived with Harold's family for the next 10 years. He was treated as one of Harold's own sons. He ate at their table, trained in combat with Harold's son Sven, and learned how to manage an estate from Harold himself. He was now Harold's foster son. Harold was his foster father. The bond between a man and his foster father, foster mother, or foster siblings was sacred. An insult to one was an insult to all. This relationship had legal and social weight. If Eric were ever in trouble, he could count on the support of Harold's family as if they were his own. If his birth father, Olaf, were to attack Harold, Eric would be in a terrible position, torn between his two families. The act of fostering was a political tool to create alliances and ensure peace, but it was also educational. A boy might be sent to his maternal uncle to learn the ways of his mother's family. He might be sent to a skilled warrior to learn fighting, or to a successful trader to learn the sea routes. It broadened a child's network of kin and gave them skills they might not learn at home. When Eric came of age, he returned to his father's household, but he was a changed man. He was now the foster brother of Sven. The land dispute between Olaf and Harold was forgotten. The two families were now bound by the shared love and responsibility for a child. An attack on one family would now be seen as an attack on their own foster son, a deep dishonor. Through the simple act of raising a child, a potential war had been turned into a lasting peace. Number 13, a wedding was a multi-day public feast. In the year 1015, the marriage of Ragnhild, the daughter of a wealthy Icelandic farmer, to Gunnar, the son of a Godi or local chieftain, was not a quiet affair. It was the social event of the year for their entire region. The wedding, or brudkaup, was a public celebration that legally finalized the union. It was a multi-step process that took careful planning and the participation of the whole community. The process began with the betrothal contract, but the wedding feast was the main event. It was held at the bride's father's farm. Preparations began weeks in advance. Extra ale was brewed, sheep and cattle were slaughtered, and fish were salted. The feast was meant to display the family's wealth and generosity. It had to be impressive. Guests traveled for days to attend. On the day of the wedding, Gunnar and his family arrived in a formal procession. The ceremony itself was not religious in a modern sense, even after the conversion to Christianity began to take hold. It was a legal and social ritual. The central part was the public acknowledgement of the marriage contract. The bride's father would formally hand her over to the groom. Oaths were sworn. The bride price and dowry were formally exchanged, or their transfer was witnessed. Then the feast began. It would last for a minimum of 3 days. To skimp on the food or ale would be a great shame on the host family. There was music, poetry, and games. It was a time for the two families to bond and for the community to witness and celebrate the new alliance. A key moment was the broodlaup, or bride running, which was a ceremonial procession that led the bride to her new home. In some traditions, the groom would be presented with a sword from the bride's father, symbolizing the transfer of the responsibility for her protection. On the first night, the couple was led to the bridal bedchamber in a ceremony attended by witnesses. This was to publicly acknowledge the consummation of the marriage, which was essential for it to be legally valid. The day after, the groom gave the bride her morning gift. The entire event, from the arrival of the guests to their departure days later, was a public performance. It cemented the marriage in the eyes of the community. There were no certificates or government records. The memory of the guests was the record. Everyone who attended the Brudcoup was a witness to the fact that Ragnhild and Gunnar were now legally husband and wife. A marriage performed in secret would have little legal standing. It was the public feast that made it real. Number 12, concubines were a recognized part of society. Harald Fairhair, the first king to claim dominion over all of Norway in the late 9th century, was said to have had many wives, but the sagas also record that he had many other women who bore him children. These women were not his wives. They were his friller or concubines. This was a recognized and accepted social institution in the Viking world. A frilla was not a prostitute or a secret mistress. She was a long-term partner of a man, often a man who was already married. The relationship was public and had a degree of legal and social standing. This was especially common among powerful and wealthy men who could afford to support multiple households. The key difference between a wife and a frilla was legal and financial. A wife was secured by a formal marriage contract, a bride price, and a dowry. Her children were the primary legal heirs to the family's main property, the odal land that was passed down through generations. A concubine had no such contract. There was no bride price paid to her family. However, the children of a concubine were not considered illegitimate in the modern sense. They were recognized as the man's offspring. They were part of his family. The father had a responsibility to provide for them. They could often inherit property, though usually not the main ancestral lands. A son born to a concubine could, if he was capable and his father acknowledged him fully, rise to a position of great power. In fact, several Norse kings and jarls, like Earl Hakon of Norway, were the sons of concubines. A woman might become a frilla for several reasons. She might be from a lower social class than the man, making a formal marriage politically difficult. The man might already be married for strategic reasons, but prefer the company of his frilla. The relationship was often based on affection, something that was not always a factor in a contracted marriage. But the position of a concubine was less secure than that of a wife. A man could end the relationship with a frilla at any time without the legal process of a divorce. She had no claim to his property if he left her or died. Her security and that of her children depended entirely on the man's goodwill. It was a step above a casual affair, a recognized social category, but it was a significant step below the legal and economic security of being a wife. Number 11, impotence was a man's failing, not the woman's shame. In the early 11th century, in a settlement in Greenland, a woman named Thora was married to a man named Einar. Well, they had been married for 3 winters, and she had not become pregnant. In Norse society, the primary purpose of marriage was to produce heirs to continue the family line and inherit property. A childless marriage was a serious problem, but the blame for the lack of children was not automatically placed on the woman. The law recognized that the man could be the reason for a barren union. The Icelandic Gragas law code had a specific provision for this. If a couple could not have children, the wife had the right to divorce her husband on the grounds of impotence. This was a delicate matter, but it was treated with legal seriousness. Thora could not simply claim Einar was impotent. She needed to prove her case. The law provided a strange but practical method. The wife could, with the backing of her family, demand a legal examination of her husband. She could convene a group of kinsmen who would have the right to examine the man to determine if he was physically capable of fathering a child. This was, of course, a deeply humiliating prospect for the husband. Often, the mere threat of such a public examination was enough to make him agree to the divorce and the return of the wife's dowry without a fight. If the wife successfully divorced her husband for this reason, it was considered his failing. She was seen as blameless. She could take back her dowry and was free to marry again. The legal term for a man who could not perform his husbandly duties was rager or arger, words that carried a heavy weight of shame and unmanliness. This law reveals a practical approach to marriage and family. The goal was heirs. If that goal was not being met, the law provided a way to dissolve the union and allow both parties to try again with new partners. It also shows that, in this specific context, the biological fault was not assumed to be the woman's. The law provided a mechanism, however awkward, to place the responsibility on the man, giving the woman a clear and legally sanctioned way out of a childless marriage without shame. Number 10, insulting a man's beard was insulting his manhood. Njal's saga, one of the great Icelandic sagas, tells the story of a man named Njal, a wise and peaceful lawyer, and his friend Gunnar, a great warrior. But the saga is driven by the actions of their wives. Njal's wife, Bergthora, was a formidable woman. Gunnar's wife, Hallgerdr, was proud and vindictive. Their feud begins with insults and escalates to murder. In one famous scene, a feast is held. Hallgerdr makes a cutting remark about Njal. She mocks him for being beardless, calling him the beardless Carl. In Viking society, a man's beard was a sign of his maturity, his virility, and his honor. To be beardless was to be like a boy or an old, weak man. Hallgerdr's insult was not just a comment on his appearance, it was a direct attack on his masculinity. Bergthora and Njal's wife could not let this stand. An insult to her husband was an insult to her and her entire household. The honor of the family had to be defended. Her response was equally sharp. She replied by pointing out that Hallgerdr's own husband Gunnar had a grandfather who was also beardless, hinting at a family line of weakness. This exchange of insults might seem like petty bickering, but in the context of the saga, it was deadly serious. Her words had power. An insult, or nid, was a legal offense, a public insult that attacked a man's honor, especially by questioning his manliness, could not be ignored. It had to be avenged, either through a legal claim for compensation at the thing or through violence. This incident at the feast was one of the sparks that ignited a long and bloody feud between the two families. It led to a series of escalating revenge killings, orchestrated by the two wives, which eventually consumed both their husbands and many of their children. The rule here is unwritten but absolute. A man's physical attributes, particularly his beard, were tied directly to his identity and honor. A wife was expected to defend her husband's honor as fiercely as her own. An insult was not just words, it was a challenge that, if left unanswered, would result in a loss of social standing and respect for the entire family. The feud in Njal's saga shows how a simple insult, a comment about a lack of facial hair, could unravel the fabric of a community and lead to tragedy. Number 9, adultery was a property crime against the husband. In the year 990, a farmer in the Malaren Valley in what is now Sweden discovered that his wife Astrid had been having an affair with a neighboring farmer named Sten. The farmer, whose name was Ulf, was filled with rage, but his response was governed by law and custom. Adultery by a wife was not seen as a crime of passion or a moral failing in a religious sense. It was viewed primarily as a property crime committed against the husband. A man's wife was considered part of his household. Her fidelity was essential to ensure that the heirs who would inherit his property were actually his own blood. An affair introduced uncertainty into this system. The other man, Sten, had trespassed. He had violated Ulf's exclusive rights. Ulf had several legal options. The most extreme was the right to kill both his wife and her lover if he caught them in the act. This was considered a justifiable homicide in many Norse law codes. It had to be done immediately, in the heat of the moment. If he waited, it would be considered murder. More commonly, the wronged husband would seek financial compensation. This was a more practical solution that avoided a potential blood feud with the lover's family. Ulf could take Sten to the local thing and demand a heavy fine. The amount of the fine would be based on Ulf's social status. A chieftain whose wife had an affair would receive a much larger compensation than a simple farmer. The fine was a payment for the dishonor and the violation of Ulf's rights. The consequences for the wife, Astrid, were also severe. Ulf had the absolute right to divorce her. Because she was the party at fault, she would forfeit her right to her dowry and any share of their communal property. She would be sent back to her family in disgrace. Her reputation would be ruined, and her prospects for remarrying would be slim. Interestingly, the rules were different for men. A married man having an affair, especially with an unmarried woman or a thrall, was not a crime. It was generally accepted as long as he continued to support his wife and legal family. His wife had no right to divorce him for it. Adultery only became a legal issue if a man had an affair with another man's wife. In that case, the crime was not against his own wife, but against the other husband. The entire legal framework was designed to protect the husband's lineage, property, and honor. Number 8, a widow held a position of power. And Sigrid the Haughty was a powerful woman of the late 10th century, said to have been a queen of Sweden. When her husband, King Eric the Victorious, died around the year 995, she did not fade into the background. As a widow, or ekja, she entered a new phase of life, one that could bring significant power and autonomy. A widow in Viking society was in a unique position. She was no longer under the authority of her father or her husband. She was legally independent. When a man died, his widow was entitled to her dowry back, as well as her mourning gift. In addition, she was typically entitled to a portion of her husband's estate, often a third. This meant that a wealthy man's widow could become a very wealthy woman in her own right. With this wealth came control. Sigrid became the head of her own household. She managed her lands, her wealth, and her dependents. She was a major political player. The sagas tell us that several powerful rulers, including Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, sought to marry her. They were not just seeking a wife, they were seeking an alliance with the powerful and wealthy woman who controlled significant assets and influence. A widow had the rare freedom to choose her own next husband, or to not remarry at all. Her father or brothers could not force her into a marriage against her will. She could negotiate her own marriage contracts from a position of strength. Sigrid famously rejected Olaf Tryggvason's proposal because he demanded she convert to Christianity. She had the power to refuse a king. For a non-royal woman, widowhood also brought new responsibilities and freedoms. A farmer's widow might take over the running of the farm herself, becoming the legal head of the family until her son came of age. She would make decisions about crops, livestock, and trade. Archaeological evidence supports this. Graves of elderly women are sometimes found with keys and other symbols of household authority, suggesting they remained in charge of their property until death. The position of a widow was a respected one. She was the matriarch, the keeper of the family's legacy. While the loss of a husband was a personal tragedy, the legal and social status of a widow provided a woman with a level of independence and authority that was unmatched by either an unmarried girl or a wife. Number 7, marriage between cousins was complicated. In the small, isolated communities of Viking-age Iceland, the pool of eligible marriage partners was often limited. Everyone was related to everyone else in some way. This made the rules about who you could marry very important. Marrying a close relative was a serious concern, not just for social reasons, but for legal ones. The Gragas Law Code laid out the rules of kinship and marriage very clearly. It defined degrees of relation, and marriage within the forbidden degrees was illegal. A man could not marry his mother, his sister, his daughter, his aunt, or his niece. This was considered incest, and the penalties were severe, including outlawry. The rules for cousins were more complex. Marriage between first cousins was generally forbidden. The families were considered too closely related. An alliance between them did not create a new broader network of kin, which was one of the main purposes of marriage. It just kept the wealth and power within the same small circle. However, the sagas show that these rules were sometimes bent, especially among the powerful. A marriage between second cousins was usually acceptable. By that point, the family lines were considered distinct enough. The key was to ensure the marriage created a new alliance, rather than just reinforcing an old one. Consider a young man named Bjarni in 11th century Iceland. He wanted to marry a woman named Solveig. Their grandmothers had been sisters. This made them second cousins. To arrange the marriage, Bjarni's father had to go to the local thing and get a formal dispensation. He had to argue that the families, despite their shared ancestry, had become separate entities with their own distinct interests. He would have to show that the marriage would benefit the community by linking these two families in a new way. The concern was practical. Marrying close relatives could concentrate inherited property, but it could also concentrate inherited disputes and feuds. The church, as its influence grew, introduced even stricter rules about kinship and marriage, often forbidding marriage out to the 6th or 7th degree of kinship, which in a place like Iceland was almost impossible to follow. The Norse system was a careful balance. It aimed to prevent incest and the social problems of marrying too close, while still allowing families in small communities to find suitable partners. For Bjarni and Solveig, their marriage depended not on their feelings, but on a legal argument about how closely their blood was mixed. Number 6, the man was legally bound to avenge his in-laws. When Thorvald married Gudrid in Norway around 960, he didn't just gain a wife, he gained a new set of legal and social obligations to her entire family, her AET. This was a core part of the marriage alliance. One of the most serious of these obligations was the duty of vengeance. A few years after their marriage, Gudrid's brother Eric was killed in a dispute over a fishing boundary. He was ambushed and slain by a man named Harold and his sons. This was not just a tragedy for Gudrid's family. It was now Thorvald's problem too. The concept of honor demanded that a killing be avenged. The options were to seek justice at the thing by demanding a large payment of Wergild man money, or to take direct violent revenge. If the killer's family was powerful and unlikely to pay, or if the insult was too great, a blood feud was the expected response. As Eric's brother-in-law, Thorvald was now legally and socially bound to participate in this feud. He was expected to stand with his father-in-law and brothers-in-law. To refuse would be an act of profound cowardice and dishonor. It would shame him, his wife, and his own family. It could even be grounds for Gudrid's family to end the marriage, as he would have failed to uphold his end of the alliance. So Thorvald gathered his own kinsmen and weapons. He joined Gudrid's father's war party. They planned their revenge. The law governed this as well. Vengeance was supposed to be taken on the killer himself or someone of equal status in his family. It was not supposed to be random slaughter. You know, they tracked Harold and his sons to their farmstead. In a swift and brutal raid, they killed Harold. Now the score was even, in a sense. The two families could attempt to negotiate a peace settlement at the thing, with other chieftains acting as mediators. Or the cycle of violence could continue. Thorvald's marriage to Gudrid was a contract. By marrying her, he had agreed to merge his family's fate with hers. Her allies were his allies, her enemies were his enemies. The duty to avenge a slain in-law was one of the most serious responsibilities a man took on when he married. It was a stark reminder that in the Viking world, family was everything, and marriage made two families one. Number 5, children born outside the marriage could still be heirs. Leif was a wealthy merchant who lived in Birka, a major trading town in Sweden in the early 10th century. He was married to a woman named Inga, and they had one daughter. His marriage was a strategic one, linking him to another powerful merchant family. But Leif also had a long-term relationship with a concubine, a Frilla named Alva. With Alva, he had a son named Bjorn. In many societies, Bjorn would be considered illegitimate and have no rights. But in the Norse world, The situation was more nuanced. Though children born outside of a formal marriage were not automatically disinherited, their status depended entirely on the father's actions. The key was acknowledgement. If the father publicly acknowledged the child as his own, the child was considered part of his family. Leif did this for Bjorn. He brought Bjorn into his household, provided for his upbringing, and referred to him as his son. This act of acknowledgement gave Bjorn certain legal rights. When Leif grew old and was thinking about his inheritance, he had a decision to make. His primary heir was his daughter, born to his wife Inga. She would inherit the bulk of his property and his main trading business, especially if she married a man who could run it. This was the normal line of succession. However, Leif could also choose to give a portion of his inheritance to his son, Bjorn. This was called gifting to the spear side, meaning the male line. He could not give Bjorn the ancestral family lands, but he could give him a ship, a sum of silver, or a stake in a trading venture. To make this legal, he had to do it publicly, in a process called al-erfur. He would declare his intention at the thing, in front of witnesses, formally giving his son a share of the inheritance. This meant a man's wealth could be divided among the children of his wife, and the children of his concubines. It often led to disputes. After Leif's death, his wife's family might challenge Bjorn's right to his inheritance. The case would go to the thing, and the outcome would depend on how publicly and formally Leif had acknowledged his son. This system recognized biological reality over legal formality. A man's son was his son, regardless of the mother's status. But it also reinforced the father's absolute authority. He alone had the power to decide which of his children would be his heirs. For Bjorn, his future depended not on his birth, but on a public declaration from his father. Number 4, a marriage could be a night-only arrangement. In the sagas and law codes, there are hints of a curious type of marital arrangement, particularly in the early Viking Age or in more remote areas. This was the idea of a temporary or trial marriage, sometimes referred to as a night-only marriage or napmal. This was not the standard formal marriage contract, but a more flexible arrangement. Imagine a trader named Finn from Norway who spent his summers trading in Iceland. He might form a relationship with a local woman. A full marriage would be impractical. He could not bring her into his family in Norway, and he was only in Iceland for a few months a year. Instead, they could enter into a temporary agreement. This arrangement would be a contract for a specific period, for example, for one winter. The man would agree to live with the woman and support her for that time. He would pay her or her family a small fee. Any children born from the union would be his legal responsibility. He would be obligated to provide for them. This was a way to legitimize a relationship that didn't fit the mold of a permanent strategic alliance between two families. It provided the woman with financial support and legal protection. It ensured any children were not left without a father. At the end of the agreed period, the arrangement was over. The man and woman could go their separate ways with no further obligation other than the man's ongoing duty to his children. Or, if the match was a good one, they could choose to formalize it into a permanent marriage with the full contract, bride price, and feast. This practice reflects the mobility of Viking society. Men were often away from home for long periods, raiding, trading, or exploring. And temporary arrangements like this provided a socially and legally acceptable way to form households in different places. It was also a form of trial marriage. A couple could live together for a season to see if they were compatible. Could they run a household together? Would she become pregnant? If it worked, they made it permanent. If not, they dissolved the union without the complex legal process of a full divorce. It was a practical solution for a society on the move, prioritizing function over rigid formality. Number 3, a wife could act with her husband's full authority. Around the year 998, a landowner in Iceland named Thorstein prepared for a long journey. He was going to Norway to trade wool and to visit his kinsmen. The journey would take him away from his farm for at least a year, maybe 2. He was not worried about his farm falling into ruin. He was leaving it in the hands of his wife Odd. Before he left, Thorstein went with Odd to the local thing. There, in front of the assembled freemen, he made a public declaration. He stated that while he was away, his wife Odd would have his full legal authority. This was a formal process. She would act as his legal representative in all matters. This meant Odd was not just a caretaker. She was, for all intents and purposes, the head of the household. If a neighbor's cattle strayed onto her land and damaged her crops, she could bring a legal case against that neighbor at the thing. If a dispute arose over a property line, she could negotiate a settlement. She could buy and sell goods on behalf of the farm, hire farmhands, and manage all the finances. This was a necessary custom in a society where men were often absent for long periods. A farmstead could not be left without a legal head. The wife stepped into that role. She was not acting as herself, but as her husband. Her decisions were legally binding as if he had made them himself. During Thorstein's absence, a dispute did arise. A man claimed that a valuable horse in Odd's herd actually belonged to him. Odd did not wait for her husband to return. She gathered her witnesses, went to the thing, and argued the case herself. She presented evidence that the horse was bred on her farm. The assembly ruled in her favor. She had successfully defended her family's property. When Thorstein returned 2 years later, he found his farm prosperous and well-managed. The legal authority he had granted Odd reverted back to him. But her actions while he was away had demonstrated her competence and her crucial role in their partnership. A Viking wife was not a passive figure who waited at home. She was a capable manager, ready to wield her husband's full legal power to protect and advance the interests of their family. Number 2, a child's name was chosen by the father. A week after his son was born, in his longhouse in the Orkney Islands around 1020, a man named Einar held a small ceremony. The baby had been cleaned and fed, but so far had no name. The choice of a name was a father's prerogative and a deeply significant act. It was the moment a child was formally accepted into the family. Einar's wife, Siggy, brought the baby to him. Einar took the infant in his arms. He sprinkled him with water. This was an ancient pre-Christian custom called ausa vatni, or to pour water on. It was a ritual of blessing and acceptance. As he did this, he spoke the child's name aloud for the first time, or he named him Hakon after his own grandfather, a famous warrior. By performing this ritual and giving the child a name, Einar was doing two things. First, he was formally acknowledging the child as his own legitimate offspring. From this moment on, the child had a legal right to his protection, his support, and a share of his inheritance. If a father refused to perform this ceremony, it was a sign that he was rejecting the child. An unnamed child had no legal standing in the community. Second, the choice of the name itself was important. Naming a boy Hakon after his great-grandfather was not just a tribute. It was a way of connecting the child to his ancestry. It was believed that some of the luck, character, and strength of the ancestor might pass to the child. Names were not chosen because they sounded nice. They were chosen for their meaning and their connection to the family's history. And components of names were often repeated through generations. If a father was named Thorstein Thor's Stone, his son might be named Thorolf Thor's Wolf. After the naming, the father would give the child its first gift, a tooth fee, which was often something small but symbolic, like a small knife or a piece of silver. This gift sealed the bond. The ceremony was simple but profound. It was the father's public declaration that this child was his, a member of his clan, and a link in the chain of generations. It was the act that gave the child an identity and a place in the world. Number 1, the extended family had the final say. In the year 940, a young man named Rolf in the region of Gotaland, Sweden, fell in love with a woman named Freya. They wanted to marry. Rolf was a good warrior and came from a respectable family of farmers. Freya was the daughter of a local blacksmith. But their personal feelings were not enough to make a marriage happen. Rolf first had to get the approval of his own family, his AET. This was his father, his uncles, and his older cousins. He sat with them and made his case. They considered the match. Was Freya's family honorable? Did they have any outstanding blood feuds? Were they known to be reliable? What property would she bring as a dowry? Rolf's family debated the matter. A marriage was an alliance. A bad marriage could bring shame or a dangerous feud upon all of them. After much discussion, they gave Rolf their consent. But that was only the first step. Next, Rolf and his father had to approach Freya's family. They had to ask for the consent of her father, the blacksmith, and her male relatives. This was the formal proposal, the Bonord. Freya's father listened to their offer. He then called his own kinsmen together to discuss it. Freya herself would have been consulted. Her opinion mattered. It was considered bad practice to force a woman to marry a man she despised, as it would likely lead to an unhappy and unstable household. However, she could not marry without her family's consent either. If her father and uncles forbade the match, she had little choice but to obey. Her personal preference was a factor, but the family's strategic interests were paramount. In this case, both families agreed. The match was a good one. Rolf's family had land, and Freya's family had the valuable skill of metalworking. The alliance would benefit both. Only after both extended families had given their formal consent could the betrothal negotiations for the bride price and dowry begin. This system ensured that marriage was a community affair. It was too important to be left to the whims of two young people. It was the foundation of society, the primary way of forging alliances, transferring property, and ensuring social stability. The final say rested not with the couple, but with the collective wisdom and strategic interests of their kin.